Hello everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today we are going to be doing something a little different for the channel, or if you've landed here having no clue who I am, hi, welcome. I am going to be doing a bit of a primer on college admissions application season. So this is for those of you, it is August as this is posted, but maybe you're coming to this in September or October. If it's November, I'm a little worried for you, but it's okay. Or you see this in the future and you are planning for applying to college. You are already stressed. You're already stressed. It is stressful. I am here to help, and who the heck am I? My name is Alexa Dunn. I am a published young adult fiction author, and so my channel mainly usually is writing advice, but that does include advice on writing college admissions essays. I'm going to talk more about that. I have a whole primer on writing college admissions essays that I will link to down below, so when we talk in the essay section, I will reference that. I'm also planning more essay writing specific content because I have worked as a private college essays consultant since about 2014. The bulk of my experience has been in what I call pro bono. I have helped underserved students in Los Angeles with a nonprofit organization since 2014. Those are the cases I really like to help with. My sweet spot really is helping students who maybe are first generation, who need a scholarship to go to college, who are wonderful students but just need that help polishing and packaging and finding, hopefully, scholarships to attend great schools. But that doesn't mean I haven't helped other types of students. I have haunted the forums. I've done College Confidential and applying to college, and I love randomly helping students, especially with their essays. But I've gotten into things like helping students with their college lists and financial aid, and kind of developed a base of knowledge, which brings me to, I literally wrote a book on this, not nonfiction. I wrote a YA thriller utilizing all of this random knowledge I now have of competitive college admissions to basically be like, but what if murder? So it's called The Ivies. It came out in May. So that is some of your context. I poured a lot of knowledge and stories into this, but obviously in a fun, entertaining way. So that is who I am. I am a long-winded, rambly person, so you know I love to give you as much information as possible. More is better. So everything is nicely time-stamped down below, including this very long introduction, so you can jump around and look at the things that you want to look at. And we are going to cover a lot of ground here. I want this to be a fairly comprehensive primer of what the heck should you be doing right now, because it's super overwhelming. And I had this topic requested in the comments of some videos. People were like, could you make college application stuff? And I am happy to oblige because I am a working writer and I'm on deadline, and I'd rather make this content than writing content right now. So let's dive in. So the first step, if you have not done this already, is to talk to your parents. And you're like, what? Or you're like, duh. But my question is, did you really talk to your parents? Have you really talked to your parents about this whole thing? Because the last thing I want is next April you've got a bunch of admissions and you find out way too late that your parents have no money to pay to college, that your parents have a very unrealistic sense of what college costs and how you can afford college. They're stuck in the dark ages where they're like, well, you know, in my day, I worked a summer job or I babysat to pay my college tuition. And then you have a brain aneurysm. Things have changed a lot in college admissions, and a lot of parents, even the most well-meaning ones, simply haven't caught up. Or even if they are kind of caught up, they don't know how it really works. Maybe you know how it really works. Maybe you are intimidated and scared because you've heard all the horror stories. Maybe you don't know yet, but you're about to find out. But this conversation, this realistic conversation with your parents, is really hard to have, but it's really critical. The reason it's really hard to have is they can't treat you like a child when it comes to college admissions, and you really have to be driving the boat with college admissions on a certain level because it's your future and this directly affects you. And the hardest part of this is flat out the discussion of money, means, what is actually possible for you. You have to flat out ask your parents, How much money can you afford? Cold hard cash, like money that you can give to a school per year for my college education. You need a real answer. The answer isn't, oh, well, honey, you're so smart and wonderful, you'll get scholarships. Scholarships are not magic. They don't grow on trees. That we are going to talk about scholarship strategy and general strategy for applying to schools and like what a true safety is with financial aid and how financial aid works. And that's the thing. You need a number. You need to know, is it $2,000? Is it $5,000? Is it 10? Is it 20? Is it 30? And so on and so on. Real numbers. Then you have to have a conversation with your parents, or just do what I suggest, which is send them to the College Confidential Financial Aid Forum and let other parents school them. College Confidential can be used for good, not always evil. It's an interesting place to be. Use those parents to your advantage over there who love to explain things to people. But that is the thing. You need your parents to, well, ideally get them to tell you how much money they make. I know that is really frustrating, but if they refuse to do that, then they have to do all of the following work. But it's far easier, I think, and less stressful if you actually know these things. And part of this is a crash course in financial aid. What they need to understand, there is the FAFSA, which is the federal application for financial aid, and that is going to cover need-based aid at all schools. All schools use FAFSA pretty much, but there's a whole other financial aid level that we're going to talk about in a second. But the FAFSA, they need to fill it out, and they should be doing the EFC calculator. There is a different one for every single school, but there are also general ones, and I will link down below to one that I found to get a sense of, on average, based on their income and the FAFSA, what are schools going to expect your parents to pay? And then you and your parents need to have a come to Jesus talk about, is there a gap there? If you do the EFC and it says most schools are going to expect your parents to pay $30,000 a year for school, and your parents go, I don't have $30,000, you need to know that. That is going to impact your application strategy. But also, it might be a nice wake-up call for your parents. Show them what schools cost. You and I both know schools don't cost $30,000 a year. Many of them cost $75,000 a year, and now we start to break into hives. So you need to have this really realistic and tough sit-down conversation with your parents, which is, college admissions is competitive. Most colleges are really, really expensive. Scholarships don't grow on trees, though we can be strategic. Private loans are evil and will ruin you for life, which we will also talk about. But the point is, you have to get real, because if it turns out that your parents don't have any realistic sense and they're not willing to budge, or there's no money, you might need to consider things like the community college pathway to college. There are all sorts of workarounds, or it might be state school versus expensive privates, though asterisk, expensive privates, if you are a competitive student for competitive merit at schools that have them, can actually be a way to get more money than you would get from a state school, but that's really getting into the weeds of financial aid. So the other thing you have to warn your parents about when you have this really tough conversation is that second level of financial aid related stuff. It's called the CSS profile. This is a whole separate thing that for most private schools, your parents are going to have to fill out, and this is when it gets really gnarly. So with the FAFSA and financial aid, it is your custodial parent, the parent who has custody of you, who you live with full time, or most of the time, who fills out the FAFSA, and it is their income that determines your federal financial aid and all of those EFCs and everything. However, when you get into elite privates, which don't just go off of FAFSA, they also use the CSS profile, they want to know the full financial picture of your parents. It gets real invasive, literally everything. All the money they earn, all of their investments, retirement savings accounts, any property they might own, inheritances, for both your custodial parent and your other parent. So if you have divorced parents or even a deadbeat parent and they're rich, but don't care about you and aren't going to give you diddly squat, unfortunately, they are going to work directly against you in college admissions when it comes to financial aid. They will screw you over, and this is a really common problem a lot of students have. And this is part of the come to Jesus talk that you are having with your parent/parents. Sometimes this is, maybe it's you and the custodial parent going to the other one and saying like, look, you will be the reason child does not get any need-based financial aid, so do you care? Pony up. Again, I can't get too far into the weeds on financial aid because there's a lot here, and seriously, those parents on the College Confidential forum are pretty good at this. They can answer specific questions about your situation. But the long story short is, your parents need to realize colleges literally do not care about the cost of living where you live. Colleges do not care if you can't theoretically, realistically sell your house that you live on. Like, sure, your parents bought it or inherited it a million years ago when it was worth $300,000 and now it's worth over $1 million, but it's your home. No, as far as the college feels about what you owe them per year, the college's logic is, well, you have these assets, sell them to pay for our wonderful college. So you and your parents need to understand how brutal colleges are. They do not care if you theoretically cannot afford their school. They're gonna look at assets and basically say, yeah, you can, you have assets. It's a mess. And also important to understand, you probably do intrinsically understand this if it's your situation, the financial troubles and issues with college that low-income students have very different from the financial issues and troubles middle-class students have, but they're both problems. So like the boat that you're in is going to really vary. And I am going to talk about opportunities for high-achieving low-income students. There are more scholarship opportunities for you, or at least outside scholarship opportunities for you, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. Again, I'm not gonna get fully into the weeds on all the financial aid stuff. I guess there should be a separate video. But your step one is to have these really awkward conversations with your parents, because your step two is to figure out your application strategy, and you cannot do this unless you know how you are going to pay for college. Can your parents get a Parent Plus loan? Will they do it? Because that is a whole other thing in terms of determining whether you can afford a school. Please don't get private loans. Just that they're not even dischargeable in bankruptcy or death. Like, you and the people you're related to are literally saddled with private school loans forever. They're quite evil in my humble opinion. So application strategy. Money should be the number one thing in our application strategy unless you are very wealthy. If you know that there's just really no concern, that your parents definitely have like $70,000 lying around to pay for college every single year, you don't have to worry, and you can build your application strategy around other things I'm going to talk about. But for everyone else, the vast majority, so you start with, what can my parents afford versus your profile as a student. Yeah, this is where college admissions get so stressful, because you have to be like, what does make me attractive as a student? Are my grades good enough? Test scores, activities, and it's this spiral. None of it's great, but you do have to be really thoughtful and understand who you are as a student versus your financial situation, because it's the marriage of those two things that's going to determine your application strategy. So the number one most important thing for you to know is that most elite private schools, so all those top tier schools, all the famous schools you're going to think of, all the dream schools that every other student is going to want to apply to, more or less, I mean, it's always traditionally been the T20, so the top 20 ranked schools, but I really think it's, with a couple of exceptions, like T30s, like those kind of like top 30 schools, most of the time will not offer any merit-based aid. They don't do competitive merit because they don't have to, because they get the best of the best students in the country and in the world applying to them, and many of them are loaded, and so they can get them to pay for their school. Many of those schools are now better than they certainly used to be at offering need-based aid. So those are need-based aid only schools. This is why you have to have the money conversation, and you have to know going in what your situation is, because I'm going to tell you right now what's going to happen if you are an excellent student, outstanding student, but on paper it looks like your parents are loaded. Regardless of whether your parents are loaded, those hot elite schools, even if you get in, they are going to expect you to spend massive amounts of money. And this brings me to the thing I want to avoid and why I'm making this video. I see it over and over again every single year, which is the students who end up in April with dream school exceptions, and they can't attend any of those schools because those schools are asking for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $70,000 a year money that doesn't actually exist in any liquid real form in their family, and their parents are either unwilling to or unable to take out those loans on behalf of their children. And then you're devastated, and it's like your dream slips through your fingers. And very often, if there's not a good application strategy, those students don't have backups. It's a whole thing. So my advice in terms of application strategy, if you know for a fact that is you, high achieving, looks like you have money on paper, but you don't actually have money, be very, very circumspect in terms of applying to reach schools. And I'm going to define that and talk about them in a second. But essentially, any of those top 20, 30 elites are going to be reach schools for most students because they are so highly competitive. It's like a crapshoot whether you get in a lot of cases. And you have to know whether or not they do competitive merit. So this brings us to merit and chasing merit as an application strategy. This is my favorite application strategy. This is what I did to get into college and get a scholarship. No, it doesn't work for everyone, but competitive merit is basically where schools are willing to give students money, not based on how much money their parents make, but on the strength of their profile as a student and how badly they want them to matriculate at their school. So they will throw money at them to attract them to their school. A loaded person could theoretically get a bunch of competitive merit, and you're like, that's not fair. Yeah, probably not, but it is really great news for all of those middle class kids, lower middle class kids who are in the boat of they just don't qualify for much need-based aid, but they're not made of money. But competitive merit also helps low-income students. Competitive merit, I'm a fan, obviously. So you need to look at schools that you can look on their financial aid portal. They'll say if they only do need-based aid, and you'll see things like scholarships that are based off of GPA or special activities, named grants, and those are the kind of things that you want to look for. Also, when you're on college forums, people will talk about schools that are known for throwing money at talented applicants to try to lure them to their schools. And my advice with strategy is if money is your number one concern, you need to be a little less precious about where you are willing to go to school, because some of the best schools that offer competitive merit aren't always going to be like the sexiest schools that you necessarily want to go to, but there is nothing better than getting a darn good education, and most colleges offer a darn good education as long as they're not awful for-profit schools for free or almost free. And in fact, one of my favorite pro tips, there are actually schools that have what is called automatic merit. They are like unicorns, but they do exist, and this basically means if you meet their benchmark, which is usually a certain GPA and a certain test score threshold, and they admit you to the school, you will automatically get merit. I've most often seen this as, if you meet this, you automatically get a half tuition scholarship. If you meet this, you automatically get a full tuition scholarship. And what that ends up meaning is then there is a gap, of course, the room and board portion, which isn't cheap. You can still end up needing to spend $15,000 to $20,000 a year, but you get all the tuition free. And sometimes those schools that offer automatic merit will still pile on top of that additional competitive merit, so it is possible to get a full ride from those schools. But I like to point out those sorts of things to students. These things are out there and they exist, and so if your strategy is money-based, these are the things that you need to consider. Now, money might still be a consideration, but what is the application strategy if you're not like a star student, if you don't have the highest GPA, if you didn't nail your test scores? Though I have lots. My thing with test scores, because I wasn't a strong test taker, take advantage of this new test optional thing that's sprung up because of the little panini that we are in and have been through. Take advantage of that wherever possible if you don't have the strongest test scores. We're in a kind of a golden age of schools finally, like depending a lot less on the SAT. But even before that, there were always schools who put a lot more weight on GPA, academic records, essays, etc. Those schools have always existed and continue to exist. So that's another part of application strategy to bear in mind. If you have stronger grades than test scores, or vice versa, it is possible to look up. A lot of this comes on the forums, like you're on Applying to College subreddit or the Chance Me subreddit or on College Confidential, and you hear from other people like which schools preference which things, and you design your strategy according to your strengths as a student. So what if you are not an academic superstar or don't have a magical talent, etc., so on and so forth? So generally speaking, I advise students not overload on reaches, but especially when you're in this situation where you're a good student, but not like a crazy outstanding student, this is where your strategy has to be super, super smart and really load up on what we call targets and safety schools. But I want to really encourage you to look at admissions percentages. You want to be looking at schools that have higher admissions percentages. Essentially, they're called less selective, which I think is like such a pejorative way to put it. But you want to increase your odds basically, and you want to have your strategy have more schools on your list where you have a higher odd of being accepted, just to essentially hedge your bets. It doesn't mean you can't have some dream school reaches, but you don't want to overload on those. And also, you always want to bear in mind the average student body at a school and how you're gonna stand out. So let's say you're stressing out because it hurts me to say this, you have a 3.8 GPA instead of a 4.0 GPA. Let's not talk about weighted right now. And you're like, oh, I'm not good enough. First of all, that's bonkers because a 3.8 GPA is fantastic, but you could strategically look at schools where the 50% of the student body isn't all 4.0 people. Look at schools where you are very competitive because of where you fit into the quartiles of the accepted students, which we're going to talk about in a second. These are the kind of strategies you can bear in mind related to your GPA, related to your test scores, and other things. I have a whole section where I'm going to talk about building your school list, which will also kind of overlap with this. There are some tricks for applying that can be really helpful for school strategy. College applications are essentially marketing, human marketing and branding. Yeah, it's weird. And FYI, that's why it feels really gross and weird and wrong. Unless you're a very particular type of person, because this doesn't come naturally to most people. And honestly, it didn't come naturally to me when I was applying to college. It's something that I've come into as an adult, which is why if you can get help on any of this stuff, please take it. Take it from people like me. I don't really have the bandwidth or time to do, I don't do private consulting anymore because I have to write books now, but there are so many helpful individuals on forums, on a lot of the websites I've already mentioned, who do a lot of pro bono help, who help students for free, who have a ton of experience. You might also want to pay for a professional admissions consultant if that is something within your budget, but if it's not, there are great people who have podcasts and blogs and whatnot. I will put some of the resources that I do recommend below because it can help to get especially adult perspective, because admissions, they're all grown-ups, they're all grown-ass adults who are evaluating your application, and you can get an outsider view, an adult like me, to give you perspective on your college application and what it says about you that it might not be easy to see from your own perspective, or even your parents. Your parents are not gonna have a particularly objective view of your college application. I advise doing as much of your applications independent of your parents as you can, because I think parents can make things way, way worse. They can make you write about topics that you don't even want to write about. That's a whole other thing. And really, because I can't cover every permutation of application strategy, my number one advice really is to rely on those forums and places online that help with college admissions. There are tons of resources. My favorites, obviously, in my heyday when I was really like into it, was College Confidential. It is a mixed bag, but there's some very helpful people on there if you can kind of get through some of the there are pros and cons to College Confidential. I love the applying to college subreddit. There are also subreddits like one, I think it's still called Chance Me. There's Chance Me and Reverse Chance Me, where you basically put your profile as a student and other people help you find schools, which I'm going to talk about in the building your school list section. I mean, that's basically the advice. So this is a primer, and so part of that primer is seeking out additional resources because you don't have to do this alone. Next, I want to run briefly through reach, target, and safety schools just to kind of define them for you so you're aware of them. You're gonna hear these terms a lot. I say reach, target, safety. There are other people who have other kind of, they'll sub in different words for these things, but I happen to like those phrases. I also find it really, really helpful when you are building both your strategy and your school list to use these titles, because it helps you really look at your school list and your application strategy, and it's all about kind of statistic and odds. You don't want to overload your list with really expensive reach schools. You want to be smart and strategic about a mix of reach, target, and safety, and the ratio of reach, target, and safety is going to vary depending on your profile as a student, academically and otherwise, and your financial need. So I mentioned quartiles before. So there are a ton of sites where you can basically look up the admitted classes information for any possible school. There are a ton of different ones. Some of the ones that are decent: College Simply, Niche, Prep Scholar, College Data, there's more. Also on a ton of the individual college sites, so most of the private schools every year on the admissions part of their website will post their most recent data for their admitted class. And you should look through that because you're gonna see things like average GPA, or they'll have a range, SAT scores, and so on. And so that's a way of measuring your cold hard stats against the averages of their admitted classes. And where I mentioned quartiles, I like to find the ones that actually break it down into the top 75, so the top 25%, the middle 50, and the bottom 25. And you want to look at those and measure yourself against them, because it's never as simple as, oh, I have the same GPA and test score as, it falls into the lower 25% range. That doesn't mean you could definitely get into that school. That means you have a low statistical chance of getting to that school. It's not impossible, but it is low. That would be a reach school for you rather than a target or a safety. So that's what you really need to pay attention to. But that said, my word of warning here is it's never that cut and dry. Well, it is for some schools. So some schools really do care a ton about the hard numbers. And when you look at an entire admitted class, it can be really overwhelming, and you're measuring yourself up against their numbers. And I said I was someone who didn't have really high test scores, and it can be very overwhelming. There are tons and tons and tons and tons of colleges who they're not lying to you when they say that they don't just care about that. I mentioned it before, and it is true. I'd say overwhelmingly, I mean, there are some colleges who really do care about standardized test scores, and I'm not a fan of that because I just don't think it's the most accurate measure of intelligence or academic ability. But I'd say overwhelmingly most colleges, because obviously you're going to college to learn things and go to classes, they're really going to look at your academic record, so the rigor of your classes, how you did in those classes, academic grade trends, your GPA, and they're also going to have some measure, because they receive this from your school counselor, of where your specific high school measures up in the general scheme of things. They get a good idea of essentially how challenging your high school is, and then how you measure up against students. They are going to take deep dives on that, and those are deep dives that you're not going to see from a range of GPAs of an admitted class. And they aren't lying when they say that they care about everything else. It truly is an entire application package. And hi, I'm a writer. I really do think the essay matters, which is not to stress you out if you don't feel like you are a writer. There are lots of great hacks for achieving a great college essay, which we'll talk about. But don't stress out too much about the hard numbers is what I'm meaning to say. Reach, target, and safety is a general guideline, not a guarantee. And I actually really hate the idea that students would totally count themselves out for a school because they don't fit neatly into the benchmarks of the average admitted student. That said, I also don't think it's really healthy if you don't have a snowball's chance in heck of getting into Harvard and you waste an application fee on it. Both things can be true. Now, what is a reach school? Well, a reach school is when your test scores, GPA, and or your class rank are below the majority of the accepted students to those schools. So like, you can't even touch the middle quartile, the middle, well, I said quartile, there's really four, but like you can't even hit the middle, or let alone the top. I also generally, I kind of said, if a school admits, it's hard to give it a hard number, definitely less than 10% of applicants, but like honestly, like those T20s, when they have ridiculous admissions percentages, that's a reach for almost everyone. I mean, we say that, and yet we all know that like wunderkind who cured cancer or whatever, and we know they're getting into Harvard. But like 99.99999% of students, there are certain schools that are simply a reach for everyone. You know the elites that I mean. And then also a school's a reach if you need a lot of financial aid to attend a school and you it's a crapshoot whether you're gonna get money from that school. That is automatically a reach regardless of your academic credentials, though your academic credentials can, if a school does competitive merit, increase your odds in some way that you could get financial aid from that school. But it's going to be a reach if you don't know how you were going to pay for it. So next are target schools. That's where your test scores, GPA, and or your class rank more closely fit into that middle 50. Like you fit the mean average of an admitted student to that school. That's a nice target. You've got a nice, say, 50-50 chance of getting in, and you feel secure about the finances of that school as well. Maybe it's not a guarantee, but like you're pretty sure you can either get need-based financial aid, some merit aid, or your parents can afford it and or take a loan for it that is not going to ruin anyone's life. You should have mostly target schools on your list. You'd be happy to attend, and you can hit all of those other boxes. Then there are safeties, which is, again, it is kind of a pejorative word, but safety is a safety. This means your test scores, GPA, and or your class rank typically fall above the 75th percentile of admitted students, and this is kind of the question mark one. I've seen advice where it's like, and they admit more than 50% of the students who apply. Like, yes, that's definitely a safety. That is like a safety. But I do think a school can be pretty safe even if it has a more competitive admissions rate. It's gonna depend on your fit with the school, how well you know them, and a safety can mean a lot of different things, but you get into the nitty-gritty of a safety versus a target. Anyway, the most important thing about a safety school is that you're 100% certain that you will get in and you can afford it. So a true safety, you have to know with complete certainty that either you can pay for it out of hand or you will get financial aid and or merit aid. So the next thing that you should be doing right now is developing your school list. But okay, so much goes into developing your school list that I'm gonna stay pretty top line here. Let me know down below in the comments if you want me to do a whole video just on like finding schools and building your school list and all the things you can consider, because I could talk forever. So I personally recommend creating a spreadsheet and using target, safety, and reach to help you categorize schools. And actually your first step for doing this, which is also going to help you when we talk about essays, create your Common App account. Most schools are on the Common App, and you're gonna create a Common App account, and what's great about it is it's a wonderful way to aggregate all of these schools. When you find a school that you're interested in applying to, you can add it to your list in the Common App back end, and you can click in and you can see things like when their application deadlines are. I think it tells you how much the application fee is. These are things that you should be tracking. You need to know how many application fees you can afford, or if you're low income, how many waivers you are getting from your school, and so on. And then I do advise you create that separate spreadsheet. This is so that you can have in one place to order your brain, because college admissions is very overwhelming. You're gonna have the school, you're gonna have their deadlines, you're gonna have cost. You can put a column for EFC because you have run the expected family contribution calculator for these individual schools. You really should put it in there. I also like to have columns where you track whether they have supplements, so extra essays or writing that you have to do, and I like to actually put what it is to keep track of everything. So create like a master spreadsheet. You could put reach, safety, target. I like to section and color code things because I'm extra, but that's gonna help you build a picture and create your initial list as a brain dump. And in fact, in the brain dump phase, you don't have to fill out every single column of a spreadsheet. It's a lot of extra work, but you can start to build a picture of the schools that you are interested in. Now, how many schools should you apply to? This is gonna vary depending on your financial situation, your profile, but generally speaking, this is where you can get into real gaps with your parents who applied to college in the dark ages like me. I'd say you shouldn't apply to fewer than 10 schools. There are some people who can get away with less, especially if they're really strategic about their early decision or early action strategy, but I think it's a little dangerous not to apply to more than 10, at least certainly if you are doing more targets and reaches and fewer safeties, because it's very competitive to get into college and you want to have options come April. That said, as we know, application fees really stack up. So when you have that initial conversation with your parents, you need to get a clear picture. How many schools can you actually afford to apply to? And you may have to work backwards from that and start making tough decisions. But yeah, I think the sweet spot is between 10 and 15 schools. Once you go over 20, you're getting into shotgunning and my ears start to bleed and it really hurts. I did once help a student apply to like 30 schools, and let me tell you, those supplements are gonna ruin your life. It is backbreaking, and it actually usually doesn't help you. Shotgunning is when you just scattershot, you apply to all the schools, and especially people will shotgun all the elites. And here's the thing, they can actually find out where you've applied and you can be punished for shotgunning, in the sense that they will assume that one of those other schools will surely accept you, so they don't need to accept you because they don't want to hurt their yield. And I know one student who shotgunned in every single private elite. All of them, 20 plus, rejected that student. Thank God for state schools, but I'm convinced it's because they could see that this student was shotgunning and they all wanted to protect their yield. Be careful. And actually, I mentioned state schools, so my next tip in terms of building your list is to make sure it is varied, not just in terms of reach target safety, but school type. There are, of course, all of those privates. So there's elite privates, like the really competitive privates. Then there's like less elite privates. It's good to look at both. Less elite privates are more likely to have competitive merit aid because they want to attract you to their school. It's good to look at those huge research universities, that's private and state, as well as liberal arts colleges, smaller schools, LACs is what we call them. If you're in a state that has a multi-tiered state school system, consider all of those tiers. California has one of those. We have the UCs as well as the CSUs. The UCs are larger state schools that are more competitive. You submit essays for those. The CSUs are based purely off of stats. Actually, I guess they're large as well. They're just slightly, it's a tiered system, but you don't submit an essay to apply to CSUs. CSUs are slightly less expensive than a UC, and generally I advise to California students when I talk to them, if a UC isn't a safety for you, and remember it has to be a financial safety, and UCs, even for in-state students, are kind of expensive, then the CSU tier has to be your safety tier. And there are other states that have this as well. Or if you're just in a state that has multiple state schools, it cannot hurt to apply to more than one. Hedge those bets, especially in terms of location, finance, etc. You always want to make sure that you have a lot of options. Now we get into the nitty-gritty, and this is where this could be a whole separate video, but I will really top line this. You need to consider these things when you're building your school list, and it does get overwhelming. Things you can consider: location, urban, suburban, rural, geography and weather, and your personal travel logistics. I find people really forget this one. This is part of the realistic conversation you have to have with your parents, because it's not just how much does the school cost, it's do you have to pay a ton of money to fly to that college? Is it feasible to drive to that college, and who is driving you, and where does the gas money come from? Are you shipping your things to school, or again, driving? Or is it everything you can fit into a single suitcase? Are you going to be able to come home for holidays, like afford to come home for holidays, and is that a deal breaker for you? And this can really inform how basically close to home you need to be for college. And I think people will forget about this. There are additional expenses, but also social and emotional things that come from going really far away for college. I personally was someone who went pretty far away for college, and my family didn't have a lot of money, and I didn't go home for Thanksgiving. I mean, I basically had, the last time I was home for Thanksgiving was my senior year of high school. Like, once I stopped doing it in college because I literally couldn't afford to go home, you get into Friendsgiving if that is your college experience, but you have to determine like how critical that is for you. Basically, I could only afford to go home twice a year because I went further away for college, and I had to factor in the cost of flying me and my belongings home. Next, of course, is school size. Do you want to be at a small school to guarantee personal attention? Do you like knowing all your classmates? Are you like me and you prefer to blend in with the crowd? I love a large school, but you might hate a large school. So you need think about that. I mean, they come in all flavors. There's like really small, there's kind of small, there's mid-size, there's massive, and the massives, I will say the massives differ depending on whether you're going to a state school, like a large university, or a private school, and depending on how many colleges they have. So I went to a ginormous school, but my individual college was about the size of my high school. And I ended up really liking that because like I kind of knew people, but I could blend in with the crowd when I wanted, but my classes weren't massive. So you can look into those things and decide what's going to be best for you. I mentioned school type, I mentioned public, private, and LACs. I also want to mention tech schools, techie schools, so like Georgia Tech or MIT. And if you are a super artsy person, you might not find your major or be happy at those schools. But in terms of application strategy, this is where I wanted to put a little button in it, where you can be strategic, is certain types of students are going to be particularly attractive to a school if they represent something that they don't get in large numbers in their applicant pool. If you are high achieving and you represent a type of student who doesn't apply in as large numbers to a certain type of school, it can be to your advantage. And to that end, LACs, a lot of them have STEM programs. They're not going to be as vocationally based or sometimes as strong as some of the other schools that you're looking at, including tech schools, but they have them and they need to fill those programs. And so you can actually really stand out applying to a liberal arts college, applying to something that isn't like English or theater or so on. Like, be strategically smart. You can also use geography to your advantage. Schools like to have a geographically diverse class, and you're like, really? I use this to my advantage coming from the South, going to a school in the Northeast, and most of those big schools, they literally divide their admissions piles by region or state, and if they get 5,000 applications from New York, because the school's in New York, but they only get 400 applications from Georgia, you are more likely to stand out in a pile of 400 than you are in a pile of 5,000. And so you can often use geographic distance to your advantage. Pro tips. And the other thing to think about where you will be happy and what is going to work best for you is co-ed educational environments, which is of course the vast majority, but there are well, they're traditionally called women's colleges, but most women's colleges have really come a long way, and it's as long as you identify as a woman, you can attend those schools. A lot of them are much better with non-binary and trans students now, and they represent safe single gender educational spaces. So that's like a school like Wellesley, which is very famously a women's college. You might really want to be in that kind of environment and thrive, or you might know that that is not going to be the environment for you, and then most colleges are basically co-ed. And then you look at things like your major and your minor. Obviously, if you want to major in something super basic, you can study it literally anywhere, but you might want to do something more specialized, and you can kind of work backwards by Googling like best schools for X. You could use things like study abroad programs. If you want to go to a very specific location, you could work backwards from a school that has that program. I call those kind of like activities and amenities. If there's certain extracurriculars or clubs and such that you definitely want to have at your college, maybe it's a newspaper, maybe it's a theater program, maybe it's specifically that they do musicals and they allow non-theater majors to be in those musicals. There's all sorts of things that you can consider in terms of basically finding schools where you will find fit and be happy to spend 4 years and give them money and get an education. There's also things like amenities, like if it matters to you that they have a state-of-the-art like athletic center, those sorts of things, though. Tell you that's why they charge you more for those schools. So you basically have to decide on your must-haves, your nice-to-haves, and your absolute deal breakers. And that is how you start to whittle down to a college list. You determine what's going to make you miserable. Something I just didn't mention. You can consider Greek life, you can consider sports culture, you can consider religious affiliation. So an example of me, I very specifically sought out schools that had no sports culture, not a strong Greek life, so I didn't want to go to a school where I would be totally adrift socially if I didn't join a sorority. That is what a lot of the schools in the South were like, and I knew that I wouldn't thrive in that environment, and I'm just deeply secular. And mind you, a ton of schools are secular, so that part was easy. But you might actually, it might be really important to you to have a certain religious affiliation and ensure that you can attend services and join groups for your religious affiliation, and so you can work backward from that to find schools that fit that as well. So the thing about deal breakers that I just want to disclaim, it's good to have them. I had them, as I just said, but I was also 17 years old and I had very strong ideas about who I thought I was as a person and what I thought would make me happy. And I have no regrets about college. I went to Boston University, by the way, if you're wondering. I loved it and it changed my life. I wanted to be in an urban environment at a really large school that had a good journalism program. That would give me money. That was my checklist without Greek life or sports culture. The thing is, be very thoughtful about what your deal breakers actually are. Because I mentioned that whole thing about strategy and thinking a little bit outside the box, and especially if you're chasing competitive merit aid, that maybe you need to be a little more like, well, maybe I am open to going to the University of Alabama, which by the way, offers competitive merit. And like think outside of what you think you want. And I think as an adult now, I might have actually really thrived and pushed myself as a human if I'd gone outside my comfort zone and gone to, say, a small school, or gone to a rural school, or gone to an a single gender educational environment. That could have been really interesting. Heck, a large university like a state school, maybe not my state school, but someone else's state school, like, especially now that I live in California, I'm like, it would have been really interesting if I'd gone to a UC. I also completely ruled out moving to this side of the country. I only wanted to be on the East Coast. And now I live in California and I'm like, my life would be completely different if I had actually been open to applying to schools out here. So think about your deal breakers, but also don't be afraid to push yourself out of your comfort zone here and there for college, because you might surprise yourself. And so how do you actually find schools? So join a lot of those forums that I mentioned, all of them. College Confidential definitely does. I mentioned subreddits. I'll link to everything down below. They have, essentially, it's called Chance Me. There's also Reddit goes so far as to say reverse Chance Me. And it's, Chance Me is essentially where you say, I want to go to this school. I want to apply to this school. Here are my stats. Do you think I can get in? And reverse Chance Me is, here is who I am and my stats. What schools do you think would be good for me? And that latter one, I think that can be really, really helpful. If you're just overwhelmed, people love to help and be armchair with college admissions, myself included. So utilize those forums and like put stuff up and ask people for suggestions. And then when people suggest schools, do a deep dive on research. Now, how to navigate school websites is actually a whole other topic, and you're like, it's not that hard. You'd be amazed. I have had to teach students how to do this, and I've been able to find things on school websites that they were not. It is weirdly a talent, and in fairness, some school websites are awful. They're really terribly built. And there's also the magic of Google Foo. As I mentioned, you can work backwards. You can be like best schools for X, and you can find schools to look at. But if you're interested in basically a separate video just all about like schools and more on strategy, let me know down below. I can do that. Which brings us to essays. This is the third thing you need to be doing right now, and you're like, this is so overwhelming. I know it is. I'm so sorry. As I said, I have an entire video on how to write a great college admissions essay, which is also very, very long. So I will link to that down below, some of my nuggets. And I do plan on making some additional college essay related content since I am a writer and this is a writing channel and that is what I have the most experience in. Let me know down below in the comments specific questions you have. Maybe I'll do something Q&A style, but essays. So first, deep breath about essays. No, you don't need to be writing all of your essays right now. Unless you're watching this in November, you need to write your essays. Let's say it's August, September, you're watching this. Right now, you need to absorb and digest. So go to the Common App website, look up the prompts. Don't worry, I'm gonna link them down below. Read over them. And as you read over them, let your brain start sparking. Have a document open. Maybe it's a physical journal that you're writing in. I use Google Docs. And jot down any ideas that come to your mind as you read through the Common App prompts. There's one about failure, which is really about success. There's one about gratitude. There's always ones about like things that are important to you, about your background. Jot down ideas. Next, I highly recommend you read a bunch of essays. Now that said, this can be counterproductive for a lot of people. Some people really find this derails them. It's overwhelming, it's intimidating. I personally advise that you read at least some, because when you read personal statements, you can get a sense of lots of different approaches that people take. You can get a sense of the rhythm and the length. Your Common App essay is only 650 words. You'd be amazed how efficiently you can tell a story in 650 words, but it is still a challenge, and there is kind of an art and a science to it. So reading some successful college admissions essays can give you a sense. I am going to link to some of my favorite resources. Briefly, the two that I always go back to over and over again are Johns Hopkins University posts 10 successful admissions essays every single admissions cycle, and then almost every year the New York Times does like successful college essays about money. It's for like the money section of the New York Times, but I find those really illustrative, especially if you are a student from a low-income background who wants to write about topics about, you know, challenges that you faced, working a job, supporting your family. New York Times always highlights really interesting articles about people from all walks of life, but who write in some permutation about money. And then there are also lots of books that have examples. And I see people are always, it's really tricky. You have to be really careful posting your essay to any kind of forum. People do steal admissions essays. People can be shady. And my little mini tip there is when you do share with people on websites or forums, don't share with other current seniors or high school students just to be safe. It's best to get advice from current college students or adults. So do what you can to kind of confirm their identity. But like the thing about most of the examples that you are going to find online and in books is that they represent the best of the best of the best. And this is where the intimidation factor comes in. I do think it's helpful to get an idea of form and to get an idea of what other people do. And you'd be amazed. It's not what you write about, it's how you write about it. And I think it's great to take an essay and be like, that's a mundane topic, but then they write about it really well. As a great example that you don't have to reinvent the wheel or come up with the most brilliant idea in the entire history of the world. It's writing something personal and specific to you in an interesting way. That is the art of the college essay, if only it were that easy. Again, link down below to my video. So read some, but also bear in mind that the easiest examples to find, you don't have to measure up to those essays. If you can even be half as good as them, you're gonna be pretty good for most schools. But if you are aiming for competitive elites, it can actually be helpful to see what you are up against. But yeah, right now, read the Common App prompts, start to scribble ideas, digest some information, get yourself registered on the Common App so you start seeing what supplements they're gonna want, go on the forums, and like essentially you're gearing up to work on your essay. This is a primer, this is what you have to do right now. And then watch a separate video or I'll make more videos about actually writing your essay. So last but certainly not least is money. And I've already talked a bit about money and financial aid and that whole come to Jesus talk with your parents. And also this is such a complicated, complex, nuanced topic that I will save you from me and not say too much. But the number one thing I want to say in this section, this is the primer, the things you need to know right now ahead of time so that you don't screw yourself over, etc. There are no magical outside scholarships that you are going to find, apply to, get in the spring of your senior year after you have already been accepted to a college that you cannot afford that is going to pay for college. That is not how scholarships work. That is a fiction from the dark ages of college admissions. There are some outside scholarships, but for the most part, you're just not going to be able to get any substantial amount of money that is renewable for 4 years of college that will actually make any real dent in an expensive school in the spring. You need to make sure your parents know that because they believe this fiction, and that's why they're gonna tell you not to worry about the money, and the next thing you know, you can't attend your dream school because you don't have $50,000 a year and no one can take out loans for you. So just that, you need to know that. The secret that isn't really a secret, but it's true. The number one best source for aid for college is from the schools themselves. This is why you need to know about need-based financial aid versus competitive merit. There's also this whole aspect of need-aware versus need-blind schools, though I have feelings about that. Again, that could be an entire video. It's kind of a misnomer because even if a school says that they're need-blind, they know how much money you have. There are all sorts of tricks in an application. They can figure out how much money you have. They're not, anyway. And so this means all the other stuff I've already talked about is the most important thing. It is 100% understanding your financial situation and then strategically building your school list and applying to schools. That is the number one way to figure out the money part and how to pay for college, being smart and strategic. Now, that said, my little button to end on in this money section, if you are a low-income student, and there are different definitions of that, but one that I found for one of the scholarships I'm going to mention is that if you are Pell Grant eligible, and you can check with your parents and run a calculator to see if you are Pell Grant eligible, this is something that would come from filling out the FAFSA and being eligible for this, but there are other benchmarks for being low income. There are outside scholarship programs specifically for low-income individuals, and also many that are they intersect specifically as being for marginalized students. So some of my favorite ones that I do recommend, and the key is you need to get on these right now. Most of them have deadlines in the next month or so, and they're great opportunities that you shouldn't miss out on if you really need to be chasing the money for school. The first one actually is not specifically low income, but it is a well-known competitive outside scholarship, though it is a one-time award, and that is the Coca-Cola Foundation Scholarship. It is a one-time $20,000 award, and you have to be very outstanding at community service and volunteer work, but if that is you, it is a very famous competitive outside scholarship that might be worth looking into and applying, and I believe their application is open now. The other three are all specifically for low-income students and or marginalized students. So there is the Gates Scholarship, which used to be called the Millennium Foundation, and then I was sad it went away, but it came back. And this one basically is if you meet the income threshold, if you're low income enough, and you are one of the marginalized groups that this scholarship serves, it's all listed on the website, and you get the scholarship, what they do is they will pay the gap for whatever school you get into. So let's say you apply to a school and you get in, but you only get a half scholarship, or you get a full tuition scholarship, but they're not covering room and board. If you get the Gates Scholarship, the Gates Scholarship will cover all the rest of the money. It's a super great way for low-income students to overcome what's called gapping, which is where you get a good amount of aid from a school, but not enough. And this is definitely the difference between low-income students and lower middle class or middle class students. To a low-income student, it is actually impossible to fill a gap of $10,000. Where does that money come from? And that's where scholarships like this can step in. There's also QuestBridge and the Posse Foundation. I'll talk about Posse first because you're not directly applying to it, but this is one, if you have heard this term, if you haven't, ask your guidance counselor. Posse, you have to be recommended by an individual or organization that participates in Posse. Posse basically, they locally interview students and they're basically underserved students. Like, I think they have income thresholds, but I'm not 100% sure of their exact requirements, but you basically apply. You go through multiple rounds of applying for Posse. If you are chosen, you're put into pods of, I think, 5 or 6 students, 4 or 5, 6 students, and you are sent to a partner school for Posse with that city, and you get mentorship support when you attend that school. It's basically a way of not only funding you to go to that school, because there's a scholarship that comes with it, you get a full ride to the school if you get in, but making sure you have support at the school so that you have a successful graduation outcome and finish. Posse is great. Right Girl is a Posse nominator, so we have Right Girls who go to schools through Posse. So like, for example, a Posse school partnered with LA is Northwestern. So Posse sends a pod to Northwestern every year. So if you're applying to Posse in LA, if you are recommended by a Posse participating school organization in LA, that is one of your options, just to give you an idea. So ask your school counselor if they are a Posse nominator, because Posse can be a great opportunity. Then there's QuestBridge, which you can flat out apply to, but that does make it more competitive. But QuestBridge, basically you do an application to be accepted as a QuestBridge scholar, and then they facilitate you applying to a bunch of schools, a ton of the competitive elites as well. And the competitive elites basically save spots in their class, just like they do for Posse, for a certain number of QuestBridge applicants. Obviously, it's not going to be a huge number, but but you are part of a QuestBridge applicant school, and if they can, they will be matching you with those schools. And if you're chosen for QuestBridge, you get a full ride to the school that accepts you. So those are some great options, and you gotta get on those right now. It is outside scholarships like this, oh ye few that exist, that actually cover the amount of school that you need covered. Highly competitive, and you gotta apply right now. So that's my primer, my long primer on what do you need to be doing right now for college admissions. So it's really mostly talking to your parents, understanding the finances, developing a strategy, starting to build your school list, and starting to think about essays. As I mentioned, I can definitely make more in-depth videos on each specific topic. Let me know down below in the comments specific things that you would like me to talk about, any questions that you have. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more college admissions related topics. I've been saying that for years, and this year I'm actually doing it on time. How exciting. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, this is like a writing advice channel, but I do sometimes have this fun college content, so subscribe if you are interested. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and in this case, happy applying to college. It's gonna be okay.